Go ahead, Mercedes. Thanks.
All right. So here we go. So as Allison mentioned, I'm Mercedes Restucha-Klem, and I'm an Assistant Attorney General with the North Carolina Department of Justice, and I work in our Public Protection
I got the
section.
cool chat.
And that section is primarily responsible for
The chat.
doing a lot of
The cool session.
outreach work and also
Everyone's
policy
complaining
work
about the
on issues
cybersecurity
as they relate to
laws.
public safety.
So
Uh,
like,
and in that
yeah,
regard, we consumer protection um,
she's an assistant attorney general of
is
NC, or maybe an
she,
assistant district attorney.
and so
Assistant district attorney. That's what it was. I can't read. I've been up for a long time.
sorry, there's a little bit of an echo there. So in my position as an assistant attorney general, we do outreach and policy work with different vulnerable populations, but also professional associations such as yourself on matters of consumer protection. And in that respect, we see a lot of scams and frauds. And as we'll learn as a result of this presentation, hopefully, we are one of the agencies that organizations and individuals need to report to when there has been a data breach. So kind of flipping for the first slide, if you guys don't know, now you know that the current Attorney General is Josh Stein, and he is the head of the Department of Justice, and they're elected every 4 years. Uh, might not have known that before being Attorney General for the state, he served as a state senator, and before that, he worked as a Special Deputy Attorney General in our Consumer Protection section of the Department of Justice. And so, because of that experience in that role that he had for several years, he leads several kind of bipartisan coalition of attorneys generals at the national level on different matters related to consumer protection. And so today, I really just want to talk to you guys real briefly about, and this is kind of, and I laugh because my presentation, frankly, is fairly generic for, I say why data security is important. And so the first couple of slides, you guys are going to obviously know this like way more than I do in the back of your hands. And same goes for some of the tips for prevention. I'm just I'm here for the legal background of it, and even that it's going to be at kind of a very entry level legal aspect. And I hope that you guys have, if you have questions, I might be able to get you answers to them. But ultimately, very quickly, we're going to go over why data security is important. We're going to talk about the legal definition of a business. We're going to talk about legal information, what the legal definition of personal identifying information is, what the legal definition of a security breach is, what the various notice requirements are once a security breach has taken place. And then we're going to talk about how to properly, statutorily, the proper ways of disposing of personal identifying information. And then, real briefly, talking about just some tips for prevention, which, again, you guys probably are a little bit more on the forefront of that than I could be. All right. I'm seeing in the chat that the slides are the slides looking better? Okay, great, perfect. Okay, so you guys can see my screen, so you could probably see that I was just looking at the slides. So, all right, let's talk about why data security is important. You guys know we're connected to the internet on like all different types of things. You got the routers, the cell phones, laptops, our watches. Everything is connected to the internet these days, and on those devices, all of our information is basically accessible. If you guys know that can hack into it fairly easily. So this is just kind of a little funny joke. For the average bear, when we have a data hack, most businesses don't have kind of set recovery plans, right? Like, what do we do when a data breach occurs? And there is a website, Stay Safe Online, that has kind of .org that has plans for small businesses and bigger businesses on how to come up with proper disaster recovery plans. Again, probably what you guys consult on, many of you that are on the call. Ultimately, some statistics on data breaches. we have these numbers because, as I'll mention later on in the presentation, our agency is one that requires that is one of the required agencies uh, that people need to report when they have a data breach. And so in 2019, we had over 1,210 data breaches, which is the most reported since the requirement. Now, I'll show a little graph on the next slide. That's actually a 45% decrease in the number of people affected, which is great since 2018. And an increase in reporting, that's great. To us, this is like a good news statistic because it shows that not only are people are telling us when the breaches are occurring, but also, again, the number of people aren't being affected. So people are their information is being a little bit more secured in that sense. So that's good news. Now, obviously, this is a low number, and we know that there are far, far, far more data breaches that occur than this number that is reported. This reporting requirement has been in place since 2005, and since that time, we've had over 7,000 breaches reported, affecting over 17 million North Carolina consumers. If you'll see here, the most common type of breach is hacking and unauthorized access, followed by stolen equipment, and that 14% is unauthorized access. I don't have that labeled, but it is unauthorized access. And so clicking to this next slide, this is the one that shows kind of the number of people impacted. And you'll see a huge spike there in 2017. And I might be able to do this in the, anybody wants to throw in the chat what happened in 2017 that affected so many people. You know, I'm going to just say it out loud. I can't tell actually if anybody's responded. There it is. Let's see. Yeah, I'm going to see if I can do something about the beeping too. I feel like it might be coming from my screen. Thanks, John. If you guys can pause for just 2 seconds, let me see if I can do this. I'm going to stop sharing for 2 seconds. And sorry, y'all. Thanks for bearing with me. That was coming from my screen. I had the chat feature open, and now I'm trying to get the other screen back up. And I'm trying to get my PowerPoint back up so I can share the screen. Thanks for your patience, everybody. And from the current slide, and I don't know if anybody threw it into the chat, but Equifax breach happened in 2017, and that is why so many people were affected. So let's talk about the North Carolina Identity Theft Act. That is what defines security breach, and it's our consumer protection law. It gives, it actually gives the North Carolina Department of Justice, the Attorney General, a very unique authority in that we can make civil demands on organizations if there is suspected scams or frauds or price gouging, things of that sort, unfair and deceptive trade practices. We can issue a civil demand letter, which kind of gives us access to their documents and their practices. And one of the few ways that individual citizens can kind of report bad actors to the Department of Justice is through that consumer protection section. But the Identity Theft Act, Chapter 75-60, is where we find everything that has to do with security breaches in North Carolina law. And I included the language there. I'm not going to read that out loud to y'all, but basically it explains that any business that has personal information of North Carolina residents and that's conducting business has to provide notice when there is a security breach following that breach, following the breach, and then that notice has to be done without unreasonable delay. Obviously, that says that in much different legal language, but these key terms that I highlighted in red are what we're going to be talking about when it comes to the actual legal definitions of what these are. Here, so this is a joke, but not really. Business, the legal definition, and you'll find, I think you might see on the bottom right of most of these slides, there's a specific citation to each actual legal definition. But this is, famous Jay-Z quote, I'm not a businessman, I'm a businessman, right? I stole this slide from my former colleague, Hugh Harris, that did this presentation last year with y'all. And it's true, right? Like basically what it comes down to is a business is, there you go, there are your citations down here in the bottom right. It's a sole proprietor. So anybody that's operating, doing anything, you don't have to be incorporated as a sole proprietor, but anybody that's operating and putting themselves out to conduct business is doing business. Partnerships, anybody that's incorporated, an association, any type of group whatsoever, however organized, whether or not organized for profit. So there you have it. That is what a business is under this section of the law. It's pretty broad. So all that to say, if you know that you have breached somebody's information, you are probably responsible for reporting that to the Department of Justice and other entities, depending on the size of the breach. So let's talk about what personal information is. This is a little bit kind of like a logic question, problem, but personal identifying information, as defined in this subsection 10, is a person's first name or their first initial plus their last name, all in combination with another piece of identifying information that's defined in this statute. And that statute includes a whole slew of things that I'm about to list off, such as your social security number or employment identification number, your driver's license, state ID card or passport number, your bank account numbers, your credit card numbers, PIN codes, electronic IDs, emails, account numbers, digital signatures. This is a good one. This is actual language from the statute. Oh, I went back. Oh, excuse me. My favorite is that one. Any other numbers or information that can be used to access a person's financial resources. So that's very broad. Biometric data, fingerprints, passwords, and parents' legal surname prior to marriage. So any of those things in combination with a person's first name or first initial and their last name, if that gets out in an unauthorized way, that is what constitutes a security breach. So a security breach is basically unauthorized access to and acquisition of unencrypted and unredacted records or data containing personal information. That is the legal definition. Where illegal use of the personal where illegal use of the personal information has occurred or is reasonably likely to occur, or that creates a material risk of harm to a consumer. So you'll notice that all of these are ors, and in when we're, I keep on hitting the wrong button, when we are analyzing things under the law, that or creates, it could be either of these, obviously, and so any of these, and this creating a material risk of harm to a consumer is fairly a fairly easy standard to meet, if you will, when you're trying to establish. So if somebody has these pieces of information, it's not a very far leap to establish that there's a material risk of harm to a consumer. But it does depend on the nature of the information that is released. So talking about encryption, this is the legal definition of encryption. I again laugh because I'm sure you guys know just tons more about encryption than I do. but it is ultimately the use of an algorithmic process to transform data into a form in which the data is rendered unreadable or unusable without use of a confidential process or key. That's that legal definition. So I imagine if I'm trying to think of things from your perspective, you guys have amazing technical minds in that whatever you come up with in any way or form, if it meets this kind of definition of an algorithmic process that transforms data, knowing that even if it is breached, that that it is encrypted. I'm not sure what I'm trying to say there. So encrypted data can also be breached, is my point. And so unauthorized access to and acquisition of encrypted data, or data that contains personal information and also has the confidential process or key that goes with it, is also constitutes a security breach. That is kind of explicitly stated, the difference between encrypted and unencrypted data, for what that's worth. There's always the exception for employees or agents of businesses who are using the data in the course of their job. And so it's authorized use, and then they have to transfer it, but it is authorized as part of their job. Often somebody that can have authorized use to data is transferring it in an unauthorized way. That obviously would also be considered a security breach. And so those are the people that kind of at one time had access to the files and become kind of like your bad actors, be it because they're like your disgruntled employee, for lack of better words, if they could have access to things that they, while they're employee, that doesn't necessarily give them access to what they're supposed to be, the information that they're giving out. So let's talk about notice. When a breach happens, you have to give notice to, first and foremost, the affected person. Second, the Consumer Protection Section at the Department of Justice, which is why I'm here. And then if it affects 1,000 or more people, you have to report the consumer, you have to report it to the consumer reporting agencies, which are Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. And I always laugh at this point as well, because it's a little bit ironic that we have to still report to Equifax, be it that, that since they were the ones that kind of breached our information in the first place. But all of that has been settled and is in the process of being resolved. What does providing notice look like? It can be in the form of a letter in the mail. It can be by email when the consumer consents to it, or it can be by phone call. In the case that the cost of doing either of those things exceeds $250,000, $100,000, yeah, or affects more than 2.5 million consumers. Excuse me, I'm sorry, that's a dot. My bad. So let me back up. If the breach, if providing the notice in traditional ways, such as the mail, phone call, or email, and the consumers don't consent to email, if the cost exceeds more than $250,000 or 500,000 people have been affected, or you just don't have the sufficient contact information, then you can do it by email and website and media. So you'd have to do it all three ways as a substitute form of kind of individualized notice. Excuse me for stumbling over those numbers. And how do we notify the Department of Justice? Is right here. It's it's a website that you kind of plug in the information, and without unreasonable delay. So let's talk a little bit about that. What is unreasonable delay? And as we do in the legal field, it's not anything that is defined in hard numbers, right? You're going to be looking at making sure that it's consistent with the legitimate needs of law enforcement. So you have to, if there's a breach such that law enforcement needs to be contacted, and then in order to make sure that, excuse me. So making sure that your system is locked down, you have to have time to determine the contact information in place, and you'll also need time to determine the scope of the breach, right? And are able to kind of restore reasonable integrity and security and confidentiality of the system. There's different law enforcement agencies that might need to get involved outside the Department of Justice. And so consistent with their needs are the factors that go into it. Excuse me. Again, when more than 1,000 people are affected, you have to provide notice to the 3 consumer reporting agencies. The content of the notice has to include a description of the incident, the type of personal information that was breached. It has to include a description of the efforts that have been taken to avoid that further unauthorized access, right? So the reason that you've waited to give them notice is to draft this letter, right? And come up with making sure that further unauthorized access is not available before you kind of put everybody on the blast that they had a breach. Contact information for more information and assistance within your own organization. You also have to have a line in there advising people to remain vigilant about reviewing their accounts and how they can access the free credit reports that are available through the credit bureaus. And then you also have to have the contact information for both the FTC and the North Carolina Department of Justice, including a statement about identity theft. All right, so real briefly, let's talk about the proper way to destroy personal information. And this is, I guess, going to be kind of a joke when we're talking about it in the context of what you guys do. But ultimately, as is required by the statute, any business that has personal information has to take what they say reasonable measures to protect against the unauthorized access while they have it and also after its disposal. So like that does not look like this. This was some pictures that we got when this law first went into effect. Is one of the first cases that was investigated, and these are basically like employee files that had, pay records and all that type of stuff in there, just kind of like abandoned in the woods somewhere. And granted, people have things digitally now, and so it's a little bit different of an analysis. But the proper ways of destroying paper information is burning, pulverizing, and shredding, and then otherwise destruction or erasure of non-paper media. So I will pause here and say, I'm not going to give you guys advice other than just burning, pulverizing, shredding, and destruction or erasure of non-paper media, knowing that the last time I was talking about burning paper, it was brought to my attention that it is against the Open Burn Administrative Code to burn paper. You can only burn yard waste, especially in certain areas. So making sure that if you are, burning or disposing of stuff, that you're complying with your local rules and doing it in a very safe manner. Knowing that, I will say you guys probably know the technicalities of it more than I do when it comes to erasing non-paper media, right? Making sure that those things are very, very erased, and we include pictures of things like this where things are kind of just like actually physically damaged in order to make sure that they are no longer functional. And sometimes, those can probably even be revived. So here are, when we talk about reasonable measures that need to take place when you are disposing of information. I've just clicked over too many. You have to make sure that when you're working with, either employees that are dealing with personal identifying information, or staff or yourself, or if you have a contractor as well, ultimately you have to make sure that you have policies and procedure in place that are implemented and that you're monitoring and for compliance with. You want to make sure that the way that the information that you have is being disposed can't be reconstructed. And it needs to be, again, an official policy in writing that your staff knows of, and part of that policy is monitoring it for compliance, and you kind of have an audit system set up. This is good. The same goes, the statute speaks specifically to when contractors are hired to dispose of information. So even if you do hire a disposal contractor, you still have to exercise due diligence. You have to monitor them for compliance. You also have to conduct like an independent audit of their operations, including company references and making sure that they're certified. So very briefly, I don't talk on many of these in too much detail, but these are examples of kind of some high-level security breaches that have taken place that have affected North Carolinians and other people across the country. You can Google probably any of these and find out the details and with more specifics. You probably understand them better than I would. When it comes to the actual technical breaches of it, but just with respect to one breach, Uber had a situation where they released the names and driver's licenses of all their drivers was hacked into, and they had a year delay in reporting that breach and to those that were affected by it. And so there was a nationwide settlement of about $148 million. That $3.6 million of that came to North Carolina, and I believe there was about something like $100 payment at least to individual drivers, depending on like how much they were affected. And all right, so let's talk a little bit about scams and frauds. So this is we talk about this in context with data breaches because ultimately data breaches are a result of unauthorized access when you're either being scammed by somebody or frauded by somebody. Except somebody is tricking you, and there's 9 times out of 10 a human element involved in it. And so very, very briefly, I want to talk about price gouging because, as y'all know, we are here in the midst of a pandemic, and during states of emergency, the governor declares a state of emergency for the state, right? And he did so in this context on March 11th. But even during times of during hurricane season and stuff, there are certain areas of the state or the entire state as a whole will be considered under a state of emergency. And when a state of emergency is under effect, our price gouging law is in effect. And it is illegal during times of emergency to charge unreasonably raise the price of goods and services when there is a declared state of emergency. So that, again, you start talking about kind of legal language of like what is reasonable, and you have to do take into account certain factors. But if y'all are seeing that the price has been spiked on certain goods and services, or if there's any type of consumer fraud that you have or you see, you can report those complaints to that 1877 number, or also on our website as well. There's a location to file complaints there. So recently, a lawsuit that was up, I just saw a press release that came out of it, was this specific one about the Stephen Gould company that had to do, these are three actions that have been taken during COVID related to price gouging. And the first had to do with or primarily the second, the first one had to do with a company that was booting, it was a towing company that was actually booting delivery vehicles that were delivering personal protective gear to local hospitals and different facilities. And then a second one here was a lawsuit that's happening against the Stephen Gould company. And I believe that there was a recent press announcement that just came out on that lawsuit. Basically, this company was trying to charge twice or something like $10 a mask for again, personal protective equipment. Right at the height of the crisis, he kind of made this pitch to three hospitals across in North Carolina. He would have made something like a $3 or $30 million profit off the transactions. So that was, I believe there's a temporary restraining order against that. And then there's currently some investigations going on right now against online sellers, people selling things online, things like hand sanitizer and cleaning supplies. We saw at the beginning of COVID, one of the first reports that we were getting were people going door to door, trying to offer to sell home testing kits, cleaning supplies, miracle cures, things like that. So the piece of advice that we always give is, if you don't know who is at the door, don't open it unless they have a warrant and it is assigned by a judge. If you're concerned about your safety, because we were getting calls that people were getting the sense that their homes are being cased out. If you're concerned about your safety in that sense, calling the local law enforcement is who you would call. So door-to-door scams, and I bring that up because it is not. They haven't gone away, right? Like they're just knocking on your door and people are trying to get you to fill out applications to give your personal information out. That is a very real way that people are still trying to scam. It isn't necessarily living kind of in cyber. You have to give your email, right? You have to kind of give information here and there. So that is one way of things happening. So robocalls is the other kind of bane of everybody's existence. You get robocalls about any such thing these days. I got one this afternoon from the Social Security Administration. But you've seen the uptick when it comes to getting calls about the stimulus check that was being offered or something like that, or anything that's related to COVID, kind of emergency calls, knowing that government authorities are not going to be contacting you over the phone. And I have a slide as it relates to COVID tracing. But if you are inclined to report robocalls, there is an initiative. We're working with the telecommunication companies to kind of identify stories and numbers, even though knowing that they can be spoofed very easily, kind of just trying to piece together things. So if you have a particularly bad story, or if you're inclined to report the robocalls, this is the phone number that you can do that at. I mentioned contract tracing because times are changing, and we usually go around saying the government will never be calling you on the phone about things. The IRS does not call you on the phone, and it's one of those things like at law enforcement, if they're calling you on the phone, you know why they're calling you on the phone. It's not going to be finding you out of the blue. So if you get somebody claiming to be like the local sheriff, that you're delinquent in something, that is 9 times out of 10 a scam, right? But now we do have this contract tracing program in North Carolina. And so that being said, if we were to get a text from the number 45394 or an email from this email, the contract tracing program doesn't use links. So if there's a link in the message about the contract tracing or anything with the COVID related, don't click on the link. Like that is the scam in and of itself. That's going to kind of breach the system, right? These are tips that I give to the general public. Also, contract tracing program is never going to require financial information because we know that typically like the scams are going for your financial information. Some of the most common scams that we hear about that pop up are the grandparent scams, and we are seeing a whole new twist on those again when it comes to COVID and people calling, pretending to be a grandchild or pretending to be a friend of a grandchild that is needs help with medical bills or rent or utilities, and money needs to be wired really quickly. That is a very frequent scam that we see. The tips for preventing ourselves, being familiar with scams, I think is the most important thing. Knowing that the most common are kind of these imposter scams, people pretending to be somebody that they aren't, romance scams, different business and conference scams, sweepstakes scams. Like you've won something. I can give you an example literally of like every single one of these that I myself have been exposed to, and I can do that if you'd like after during the Q&A, but I will keep on going. So some factors that lead to why people are vulnerable to scams, and one of them is vanity, right? Like it's the you won this award, give me the information and send $50 and we'll get you the information that list you in this magazine, or is vanity. Somebody is getting in conjunction with financial struggles or investments, like you are the one that got selected for this special investment opportunity. Like that's kind of they're playing at your vanity. Loneliness is one we see, particularly when it comes to romance scams and your grandparent scams. We have people that are homebound, right? Especially now, much more so than ever, obviously, and so people get very lonely and they're seeking interaction. And so some of these romance scams can go for decades, not decades, well, maybe decades, but they string out, right? It's not like a one-time contact, which other scams can be. That these scams can get drawn out for years. Fear, they'll play on the fear of like my grandchild is in jail. That type of thing will lead to people turning over money or turning over information, and also just different financial struggles, legal troubles, computer problems. People that don't really know how to use computers very well often get caught up in having their information breached. These are some very basic tips about not carrying around your social security card in your wallet. Don't ever give out your social security number unless it's absolutely necessary. And if it is being asked of you, asking why and how is that information going to be kept confidential. Never writing your social security number on your driver's licenses or your checks. So this is some kind of going into some tips about things being too good to be true. That's a funny little cartoon there if you haven't already seen that on the internet. Not paying for things in advance. If you are going to be paying for things, we always advise to pay with your credit card. Credit cards can be disputed. The charges on credit cards can be disputed, and often you get that money back, or you're not on the hook with money, right? If you pay with a debit card or with cash, that money is out the window. Also, don't pay for things in gift cards. That's apparently a common way that people are scammed into giving their money away, which I always find surprising, but we still hear it a lot. And I've also heard of a new scam actually just this morning about people asking you to go to a specific ATM and entering certain codes and then inputting the money, like depositing it into separate, an account. So obviously don't give your money to people over the phone. Protecting your information, and that looks like getting a security freeze on your credit if you do not already have them. With the 3 credit bureaus, Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion, you can go to their websites. I actually just did this last week. I had to unfreeze my credit and then refreeze it back up because I was applying for something. But you go to these websites and it will put a security freeze on your credit. That doesn't mean that you can't access the credit that you already have, but it does mean that you will not be able to open new credit in your name. And it also means that other people cannot open credit in your name, right? So that's kind of the idea behind when we talk about identity theft. One of the main things that people are going for is like access to your credit, being able to get credit cards in your name. And they can't do that if you have a freeze on your credit. I've had a freeze on my credit since approximately 2013 because of a situation that I was exposed to. And I was afraid that my financial information had gotten out. And so now, as I mentioned, every time that I want to get credit in my name for some reason, I just go and I unfreeze it for a couple of days, do whatever processing I need to do, and then I get it and I refreeze it. And that's free. It doesn't cost anything. And you do it with the 3 credit bureaus. And it is probably the #1 way to protect yourself against identity theft. I said do your research when it comes to buying things. I say this in a sense of not letting yourself be sold. We use technology a lot, obviously these days. And we need to be using it as a tool, as opposed to having it use us as the tool, right? And we don't want to be a tool, as I like to say. So, if you see something online that you want to buy, don't just like immediately click on it and buy it. Like take a step back, do your research, and talk to your friends offline. If somebody is selling you something, 9 times out of 10, it's probably not the best deal that you can get if you did your research. So just kind of taking your time and avoid being solicited to, frankly. And then monitoring your finances. So again, going back to those 3 credit bureaus, you can, we are entitled, have 1 free credit bureau, free credit report a year. And so what we suggest is getting 1 of those every 4 months throughout the year. So it'll give you kind of instead of getting a snap, if you get them all 3 in 1 month, you'll get a snapshot of that for the entire year, as opposed to if you got one in January and then April and October, it will kind of give you a snapshot of the entire year. So that is a kind of a tip on that. Here we go, talk about security freezes. I already talked about that, so I'm gonna skip along. And then here's my last slide. So if, I see that there are some questions here. What about, it says PHI, personal health information. And then is notification timeline of a breach based on the time of suspicion of breach or time of validation of the breach? Those are excellent questions. So personal health information is, and I'm assuming that's, Dennis, if that's what you meant by PHI, that is related to, there's a handful of statutes related to personal health information. And it is, I assume if there is a number associated with it, protected health information, excuse me, thank you. If there's a number associated with it, it's going to fall under PII, under North Carolina General Statute. I imagine protected health information is probably defined under federal code, federal law, just because most of our laws and legislation as it relates to, yes, HIPAA, exactly. It's going to be defined under HIPAA. And so HIPAA and probably other statutes, right? So the way that the law is set up is that you depending on where you are coming from, like the best example is that I can give is that disability has maybe, I think the last I checked, something like 40 different legal definitions, depending on what jurisdiction you're in, what law you're operating under. The definition of disability under Social Security Disability Administration is different from disability under Americans with Disabilities Act. And so it's that is one question. And then the notification timeline is, it's unreasonable delay, right? So it is going to be, I would say, I would go with the time of validation of the breach, because that's when the breach occurs. But it, knowing that if people are affected, it would be worth opening up a conversation, right? I can't give you a harder answer than that, because it is always dependent on the facts. And so, yeah, once a breach is detected, what is the timeline you're required to report it based on North Carolina law? I'm going to flip back to a slide that I had to just answer the question. And ultimately, this last slide, and I think you guys will have access to these after the presentation, is where you can report things to or follow up with questions. But I'm going to flip back, and excuse me for going really quick. But when it comes to reporting and what unreasonable delay is, these are the factors that go into it. Excuse me, one more. And those are all found right here at 7565 subsection A. It's basically has to be, you have to have time to determine the contact information, you have to determine the scope of the breach, and restore reasonable integrity, security, confidentiality of the data system. And it's consistent with the legitimate needs of law enforcement. So I know that, and I'll see if I can go back to some other language. No, that is the last one. I'm going to leave you guys on that slide. Sorry for so many clicks so quick. Apologies, I can't give you a harder answer on that. That's why we have lawyers. It's you know, I had a job in kind of tech support when I was in college, and what I do appreciate about it is that it's like a lot more black and white than what I'm doing now. So I'm not seeing any more questions, I don't think.
Would you like to allow the attendees to be unmuted for open conversation for the last 10 minutes?
Yeah, that would be great. Of course. And I can stop sharing my screen and we can just like do it that way. That sounds amazing.
Okay, so very, very slowly, because it's one at a time, you guys will all be able to unmute yourselves.
We got about 10 minutes left, it looks like. So we have the chat and the Q&A.
Yeah, those two get a little confusing. They go back and forth.
Yeah, and I'm on a different computer this evening, because I wanted to make sure I had my hard line set up. And so I don't have my double screens going. I expect you guys might relate to how that can be very difficult. When you
once again, guys, if you are using an older version of Zoom, it will not allow you to talk. So if you find that you cannot talk, just go ahead and drop your question for her in the chat. All right, there you go. Everybody's unmuted. So go ahead for open discourse. I will give you a 5-minute warning, and then at 6, we have to close the chat.
Oh, thank you so much. I see there's a comment from Jason about Fridays. I can appreciate that. It is Friday at 10. But I expect many of you guys might be sticking around for some of the evening raffles and the closing panelists. So I'm also available to answer any questions about the Department of Justice in general, if anybody is curious. Obviously cannot talk about active litigations.
So I have a question.
Yes, sir.
I was in a medical office this week and got surprised by an additional notice from UNC having to do with additional procedures. And the middle of the sheet of paper was this broad highlighted thing that said that I needed to provide at least the last four of my SOCH, and that UNC was required by law to collect this information. And I found it fairly amazing that this wasn't even at the bottom of the page where it could be easily redacted. And of course, I think the whole thing is audacious, and they've got frontline people who have no awareness of the law and are put in the uncomfortable position of having to enforce this. I just wonder if you had any thoughts about that and where I should go to complain.
I have some initial thoughts on that, and that does seem somewhat off-putting. I would say that you could file a complaint with our consumer protection section, and they would probably point you in the right direction if that is not the proper place to report it to. But it's yeah.
Thanks, I appreciate that. I've worked in product security for years because stuff naturally fails around me, and I've been writing articles about Social Security number protection and other issues for over 30 years. And one of the things I've learned, both from that and just dealing with vulnerabilities in general, is that every so many years, people reintroduce old mistakes.
Right. Interesting. Okay. And I guess, yeah, if it's every 70 years, we're not typically around enough to appreciate it. We're doing it again. Yeah, no, that's interesting. Please kind of bring that to our consumer protection section's attention. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, and you guys could probably tell during the presentation, I work in our outreach section, so I have never actually worked doing consumer protection litigation. I've done other types of litigation that has to do with equal protection and childcare and things of that sort. And I will say that our consumer protection section is very much in the know and does have this kind of very unique authority to be able to kind of get to the bottom of things. So please do let us know about that.
No, I'll do that. I also happen to be a soccer referee, and it's been many years ago now, but I complained about the handling of Social Security numbers by the school districts. And at the time, it was unfortunate. They're one of the best now, but at the time, Wake County Public Schools was one of the worst. And I constantly got a runaround and note of endorsement for your office. I finally brought it to them. It made for a bit of tension at the association meetings, but they rose to the occasion and addressed the issue.
You know, it takes people to file complaints, right? And I say this in a very serious way, actually, because what happens often when we are the victims of a scam or a fraud, or if we're breached, right? We feel shame, like at a kind of a very deep level, especially depending on the circumstances of that scam, right? If it was a romance scam, or if it was, the grandparent scam, that's pretty often like the people that are the victims of that kind of feel this kind of sense of shame that's associated with it that prevents them from reporting it and prevents them from kind of stepping up and saying something about it. And so not in your circumstances, but it is very important that, if something happens, to go ahead and file a complaint, or if something doesn't sit well, bring it up to, to see something, say something, right? Like bring it to somebody's attention to make sure that things are as secure as they can be.
Yep, I appreciate that. One of my first real jobs long ago and far away, I designed and sold alarm systems and security systems, CCTV and whatnot. And very many times the customers have already suffered a loss. And one of the things I noticed with identity breaches is a lot of the same emotions, the same devastation, the same suspicion, nervousness, anger, all of that. It's very, very similar to a real life violation.
Absolutely. And frankly, the reason that we are out here doing presentations about this is because once the money is gone, the breach has occurred. It's very difficult. It's hard to stop it. The damage has been done, right? To become whole again, especially with the emotional damage and that sense of security that's been lost is impossible. So yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate your comments.
I didn't mean to monopolize your time. I'm
not at all. No, I appreciate it.
Thank you for doing this.
Thank you.